Impenitence by C.S. Lewis. All the world's wiseacres in arms against them shan't detach my heart for a single moment from the man-like beasts of the earthy stories, Badger or Moley, Rat the oarsman, neat Mrs. Tiggywinkle, Benjamin, Pert Nutkin, or, ages older, Henryson's shrill mouse, or the mice the frogs once fought with in Homer. Not that I'm so crazed as to think that the creatures do behave that way, nor at all deluded by some half-false sweetness of early childhood, sharply remembered. Look again. Look well at the beasts, the true ones. Can't you see? Cool primness of cats or conies, half-indignant stare of amazement, mouses' twinkling adroitness, tipsy bear's rotundity, toad's complacence. Why, they all cry out to be used as symbols, masks for man, cartoons, parodies by nature, formed to reveal us, each to each, not fiercely, but in her gentlest vein of household laughter. And if the love so raised, it will, no doubt, splashes over on the actual archetypes. Who's the worse for that? Marry Gup! Begone, you fusty killjoys, new Manichaeans. Here's a health to Toad Hall. Here's to the beaver doing sums with the butcher.
This is the Redeemed Imagination Podcast, a podcast of the Anselm Society on re-enchanting the church. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Redeemed Imagination Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Brown, with Father Matt Burnett and Heidi White today. And we're going to talk about Father Christmas. Because, you see, Tolkien and other esteemed writers have a beef with Father Christmas. Some of them with Father Christmas as such, some of them with Father Christmas's presence in Christianity, but a few, even of the more mythologically friendly sort, with Father Christmas's presence in Narnia. Think back to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Think about what goes into that story. Forget for a moment reading it as a child and look at it through the eyes of an adult, if you even can. And think about what goes into that story. There are fawns. There are talking trees. Wait, Father Christmas? There are appearances in this story by creatures, ideas, mythological elements from different places, from different time periods, from different types of stories. Why are they all jumbled together? Is it all just one big mess? Did Lewis make a mistake? Was Lewis just being sloppy? Was he just sort of having fun and thinking, oh, I like this concept. I think I'll just throw it in. Father Christmas. Everyone likes Christmas. That's what I would do with bacon, I think, in some stories. Just bacon would make occasional appearances because everyone likes bacon. Is that what Lewis was doing? That's what we're going to talk about today. And I'll throw it out to the group. And we're going to talk about a number of fun side issues along the way. Because Lewis certainly had an argument. He wrote an entire poem about it. He wrote a number of things about it. Our friend Michael Ward has written an entire book about it. But let's talk about it. We actually are, by the time you listen to this, you will have either experienced or be about to experience, either live or in recorded form, a dialogue that we're going to act out at our annual Christmas party with Lewis and Tolkien arguing about this exact subject. So we thought we would just take the conversation a little bit deeper. What's going on with Father Christmas, ladies and gentlemen?
Well, it's a good question. And what you said a few minutes ago resonated with me about looking at it through the eyes of an adult instead of a child, if you can. So as a teacher of literature now and commentator on podcasts on literature now, since you said that, I've been thinking, can I do that? Is it possible for me, who loved Narnia as a child, to kind of step outside of that wonder that I still have for this series and think about Father Christmas from the eyes of a sophisticated literary critic? I'm not sure I can. I don't know. What do you think, Father Matt?
I will sort of unabashedly come down on Lewis's side, and both as hopefully a childlike reader, but also hopefully is more discriminating the right word? I'm not sure. Differently discriminating, because I think it fits in by way of a couple of other links to Tolkien's literature and its scriptures, which again, we know that Narnia are not analogies, but we know that Lewis was a saturatedly Christian man. And so I think it's absolutely fair. Michael Ward would agree. Rowan Williams would agree. Diane Gladder everyone would agree, frankly, that it's totally fair to throw his stories up in the air with the Bible and see what gloms together.
Right. So what were, if someone could summarize, what were Tolkien's arguments against the appearance of Father Christmas in the stories? Who knows that kind of off the top of their heads and can explain that to the audience?
It was inconsistent with the characters, and their identities as mythological figures were not consistently woven together. Mm-hmm. And so if I understand it right, and I may not, but if I understand it right, what made Tolkien a bit grumpy was that it felt like Father Christmas was sort of just dumped in the middle of this, hands out gifts, and then runs off merrily without it being any sense of where he came from, what his role was to be, and how what was the effect of his appearance afterwards. He felt like it was just sort of dumped in and kind of willy-nilly.
So basically, Tolkien's argument was that Narnia experienced Christmas much the way that most of us experience Christmas.
Huh. Go on.
Unpack that.
Appears out of nowhere, gives us gifts, and runs off willy-nilly.
Huh. So it is a literary argument, a bit of a scholarly argument. And he's not wrong about that. A lot of Lewis's characters, that the poem that you read a few minutes ago, Father Matt, Impenitence. It's a short poem, an apology, a defense of his use of archetypes kind of jumbled together, I think is the phrase that he uses. And he says, if it splashes over onto the actual archetypes, that's
all the better.
Right. And I think his point in that is that the archetypes were never the thing itself. That there is an order to archetypes. Those of us who understand that, who study that, the idea of archetypes being a symbolic representation of some kind of universal truth in the form of a recurrent literary motif or figure, something like the wise guide. You've got Dumbledore, you've got Gandalf, you've got these Yoda. Right. Throughout these pop culture and literary stories, there can often be a hero who's trained by some kind of wise hermit or guide or wizard along the way, who has these magical powers, lives a long time, knows more than any human being ever could or should, and has suffered greatly and overcome. That's what we're talking about when we talk about archetypes. And you can see that in many ways, like the faithful sidekick, like Samwise Gamgee. That's another archetype. The wise woman, the old crone, the beautiful maiden who appears and helps a knight on his quest, whatever it is, those archetypes exist throughout literary history. And there is an order and a method to them. But does a child need to know that to recover the sense of wonder? That seems to be what Lewis is claiming.
That's a great question. I mean, so thinking archetype, thinking like Lewis says, sort of inherent qualities of the universe that are then captured in a character. So Tumnus is sort of winsome, delightful, ironic way of relating. And as you can think of that kind of person or that kind of archetype. The centaurs is the huge, strong warrior kind of thing. The mice, it was interesting. I didn't even notice it now, but he mentioned the mice, the mouse's adroitness. And in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's the hundreds of mice that sort of scamper up on Aslan and chew away at his bonds. A picture of their adroitness, I would offer. And so with Father Christmas, I don't think I'll just go ahead and throw this out there, and you may throw it out too. But certainly it's not that it doesn't fit the story. I mean, what's one of the refrains of this? Always winter, never
Christmas.
Right. So it's not as if there's no precedent for Father Christmas to show. It's not as if there's no precedent for his appearance and for his giving gifts of particular value to particular people. Right. So this is I would suggest that this is a strong literary piece. Tolkien himself. What happened when Galadriel sent off the fellowship? She gave each one particular gifts to be used by that particular person in upcoming specific situations. And I'm going to go to Ephesians 4, right? Christ has descended and then ascended as a conquering hero, frankly. And from his reign over all the earth, what does it say? He gives gifts to each one. He gives gifts to men. And then he goes out and says, he enumerates some of the gifts, prophets, teachers, pastors. So this idea of giving gifts to particular people for particular purposes via Father Christmas, who is an English icon, right? An English literature icon, actually. I think it's a wonderful moment.
Okay. But Father Christmas specifically? So Tolkien wants the character that gives everyone special gifts and sends them on their way. So he takes, okay, I want this archetype represented for a particular reason. So I will create a character that fills the archetype. Seems to me that Lewis just takes the character. I mean, it's as if I sat down to write a space fantasy story and said, all right, I want a villain who's just really, really scary and dark and awful. I want like my Darth Vader character. In fact, I'll use Darth Vader. Isn't that what Lewis is doing? He doesn't take the archetype. He takes the actual thing.
Right. Well, the other piece to that, along with what you're saying, that I think is fair, and this is where I'm trying, as you said earlier, Brian, this is why I said I'm trying to take off my child glasses and put on my literary critic glasses, because I'll say if I encountered this story as an adult trained literary critic, I might react exactly as Tolkien did. Because what Tolkien did was he was exceptionally careful with medieval archetypes that he put into Middle Earth. He was scholarly about it. He was careful about it. He wanted to honor these archetypes because what Tolkien and Lewis and the Inklings were trying to do was to recover a sacramental vision of the world through the medieval literary archetypes. That was an unqualified statement from both of them. Mm-hmm. And so Lewis, who wrote these children's stories, as he says in the poem, he says, what he's saying seems to be the sacramental vision is deeper than the archetypes. That's the thing itself. That's what we're trying to get at, is the gospel story shining through whatever fiction we're creating. So if we end up kind of jumbling up or disorganizing the actual archetypes, that's okay, because we're really getting to the thing itself, the thing underneath it, the greater story. What Tolkien is saying is, but they already did that. That's already been settled. There's a tradition, and we should work within the tradition and be careful with it. And so, but they're both trying to do the same thing. And so they're coming at it from these two different angles. And I think now, as more of a traditional literary critic, if I came across these stories as an adult, I might say the same thing. Wait, you've got fawns and Father Christmas?
That's cheating.
Yeah, it's cheating. It is. But I don't disagree with Lewis's larger point, which is the thing itself is more important. So, and Tolkien might say, yeah, but that already is there.
In what way is it already there?
Meaning there is already a tradition. When he wrote Middle Earth, in fact, I have a girlfriend who's teaching medieval literature and to middle school kids, and she's teaching Tolkien at the same time. Mm-hmm. Because if you want to understand the medieval mindset, read Tolkien. You've got it. Even though there's magical creatures, actually the medievals believed in that. They really saw those thin places. So to them, mermaids and elves and fairy kingdoms were actually real. We just couldn't see them. And so Tolkien's getting to the sacramental mindset of the medieval world in a way that is utterly consistent historically, according to what they believed. And Lewis did kind of just take stuff and put it in his stories as it seemed to kind of come alive to him, which I think is a perfectly valid way of doing it.
Yeah, his writing these stories, I think as most people probably know, happened fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. I'm not actually trying to defend him. I think I'm still going to say that Father Christmas, as particularly having a much more, if I understand correctly, I may not, but if I understand correctly, having a much more pervasive place in the minds of English and English people than he does for Americans, although Tolkien obviously the exception. But if that's a more pervasive figure, and if he's not the archetype, if he points to the archetype of right, gift giving for a purpose and to move the world forward in good ways, right, and defend the defenseless and heal the broken, all of which would be two of those gifts three of the gifts that Father Christmas gave the kids. If that's the case, and because he chose children's fairy stories because they were leaner, because they forced you to get to the point more quickly, right? Because they forced you to leave out things like gratuitous violence and sex and that kind of thing, because the genre forced you to have a leaner, more focused writing. Is this actually inappropriate? I mean, he wasn't trying to write the full mythology that Tolkien was trying to write. And so within that understanding of the genre and the reason he chose the genre, I'm just not so sure that it's entirely out of the blue. And especially, again, always winter, never
Christmas.
How are you going to resolve? What a great way to resolve that dilemma than to bring in Father Christmas. Hello.
I totally agree. In fact, I think it's the only way to resolve the dilemma. And that, I think, is the literary argument against Tolkien's literary argument,
right.
Which is once you say always winter, never Christmas, you have to have Christmas.
Right.
And what is our archetype for Christmas? Father Christmas, Santa Claus, right? And plot point wise, you need some way to get the gifts to the kids. And so it's an elegant resolution to the always winter, never Christmas and the getting the gifts. Yeah. And I think it in some ways sacramentalizes the modern heresy of Santa Claus, that he just gives you what you want. The Father Christmas in Narnia gives redemptive gifts. Gifts that are beyond the children's abilities, gifts that participate in the healing of the land.
And actually takes them into peril.
Yes,
frankly.
Agreed.
I mean, they're gifts that project them into perilous situations, not
right.
Sort of warm, fuzzy, comfy situations.
They're not self-indulgent. And so then when, we used Narnia's Father Christmas as a way of, we read that section and said, this is what the world is distorting when it talks about Santa. This is the real purpose of gifts. We use that as a teaching tool in our home.
That's great.
And so I think that would be kind of the moral and the literary argument that defends Lewis's choice of Father Christmas.
To my sons, 28, 26, and 21, I'm sorry I didn't do that. I wish I had.
Grandchildren.
No, that makes perfect sense, because there's also another aspect in play with Narnia that's not in play with Lord of the Rings, which is that there are people in the Narnia stories, there are people from our world going into Narnia. And so we are experiencing Narnia not only with the eyes of our world, but with the eyes of actual characters essentially representing us in Narnia. And there's a dynamic at play in the stories that is not in play in some of the recent movie adaptations. You see this with Prince Caspian, for example. With the stories, there's always this element that whatever you bring of yourself into Narnia gets redeemed, refocused, pointed back to what it's supposed to be, which is one of the reasons the Prince Caspian movie, in my view, was so terrible, because it flipped the dynamic and had the children essentially bring all of their earthly faults in with them, and that was the focal point of the story.
Great point.
And with that dynamic, you could almost make the argument, in light of what you just said, Heidi, that Father Christmas is there not only for the story and not only for something that Lewis was trying to do from a literary standpoint, but also for us to re-enchant Father Christmas himself for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Amen. That'll preach.
which is something that he does fairly consistently, and in which in turn, Tolkien's perspective as far as approaching it, I'm almost hesitant to use the word tradition in this sense, but he wants to work within a box. He wants to work within a framework that's been provided. And Lewis is more interested in playing with the framework and maybe making you see it a little bit differently.
Right.
Not to damage the framework, but actually to re-enchant it for you.
Sure. Well, and that you're exactly right. That is one of the main differences between their work, which both of them produced work that is just so redemptive, deeply so. And they, even though they disagreed on some things, kind of like Peter and Paul in Scripture, right? They both have been so redemptive in the modern world, in re-enchanting the modern world and remembering the goodness and in fighting darkness. So we don't mean to be pitting them against each other, but there are distinguishing differences between what they were trying to do. And you nailed it. Tolkien was trying to recover a tradition. And Lewis was saying, what was the tradition trying to get to in the first place? That's what I'm trying to get to. And both of those have such value and are very different from anybody else in their generation.
Even just Lewis and his idea of supposals. I mean, the more I think about Narnia, and it's some of his later work, right? And I think some of his very best thinking shows up in there. I really do, as some of his later work. But I think he gave himself the permission with these supposals to actually not be watertight.
Right.
So he gave himself the permission to say, suppose Father Christmas showed up in Narnia. What would that look like? And then he wrote it. Right? Suppose there was a king who sacrificed himself on behalf of his people in Narnia. What would he look like? And he wrote it. As we all know, it's not a table. You don't have a table where you have one line, Jesus to Aslan, all this sort of stuff. It says, I've always been trying to figure this out, and I would love the references to somebody who does it better, but it's as if he throws Narnia stories up into the air, and then you throw whatever story you want to up in the air with it, the Bible, literature, and you sort of see where up in the air these things kind of have resonance. It's not random, but it's not a table either. Mm-hmm. And so if he's working with supposals, again, I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, but Father Christmas, what's it look like if Father Christmas shows up in Narnia? He comes in at a crucial moment, right? He brings comfort. At the moment is actually a very surprising plot twist, because you think it's the witch that has overtaken them, and is about to kill them. And in fact, it's Father Christmas. And he gives them these gifts that are, again, warrior-like gifts and healing gifts that will take him into peril. Anyway, I appreciate Lewis's work with this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and he does the same thing with the space trilogy. Half the space trilogy is as you put it, the supposals, and half of it is designed to get you to look at something in our world with fresh eyes.
That's right.
And see it with that different light. He doesn't sit down and say, I'm going to make this coherent argument for X. I mean, he does plenty of that in his other stuff, but he recognizes that I could sit down and make a particular argument to you about something that we're losing with regard to how we view gender roles, or how we view authority, or how we view the supernatural and the natural in their relationship. He could make an argument about that, or he can just throw it up in the air and say, okay, here's a hypothetical for you. What if?
Let it speak for yourself. Yeah.
Right. It's brilliant what he does. And he's a very careful writer. So we don't want to give any impression in this conversation that he was haphazard, that he didn't do things on purpose, that he's like, oh, let's just throw in Father Christmas here or whatever. And Merlin sounds interesting. Let's just put him in that hideous strength. He's doing something very intentionally in saying throughout generations, people have been reaching for the thing itself. And we create archetypes that represent that truth. What if, suppose, those things came together in some way? What would that feel like? And in Narnia, because it's a children's story, it feels very seamless. When you're reading the story as a child, no one's like, wait, hold on. No 7-year-old is going to say, Father Christmas doesn't belong in Narnia. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful integration of this imaginative world with the world that children actually believe in and interact in and consider real. And that is the sacramental worldview, that a child believes that a magical being is going to leave them a redemptive gift to participate in the salvation of the world. That is the sacramental worldview. That's what we're all trying to recover in Reenchanting the Cosmos, right? But in That Hideous Strength, his goal is the opposite. His goal is to say, if the medieval world comes to the modern world, it's weird. Right. There's a dissonance between the two. Merlin shows up and condemns this character for using birth control, right? And there's a talking bear, and it's weird.
There's a thinking bear.
Yes.
Yes. Right. Exactly.
It's a very strange book. And most people encounter that book, and I know that's not the point of this conversation, but most people encounter this book and think it is strange because it is, because that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to say the sacramental world will shake up the moderns. We will not accept it.
It'll look weird.
It's Plato's cave.
Mm-hmm. Right? And as you pointed out, and you said this, Father Matt, when Father Christmas appears, it's as a surprise. And when the surprise appears, as a child, you've been set up so well for it that it's the happiest thing. And you're so excited that Father Christmas, that feels like the most, maybe not the most natural thing in the world, but the most welcome thing in the world in that moment. I mean, just
the most welcome thing. Absolutely.
Just this morning, I was showing my kids a couple of YouTube videos of orchestral performances of a couple pieces of music that I thought they would like. And I was showing them the Light Cavalry Overture, and I was showing them performance of the throne room music from Star Wars. And you could see these are not subtle pieces of music. These are very sort of bourgeois pieces of music. Everyone likes these unless you're so well educated that you know you're supposed to turn your nose up at them. But there's a reason why everyone likes them, because there are points in those pieces of music that they've built you up for, so that when they happen, you know, yes, that's exactly what was supposed to have happened. And you could see this in my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old. You could see as it started to build, you could see they knew something was coming and they didn't know what it was. But when it came, they started clapping and literally jumping up and down.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's exactly the effect I do.
Right. I agree.
Which goes back to
whether it was crafted in particular or whether it came to him instinctually. I'm actually not sure, Heidi, but either way.
And I think that points to something that Heidi's fond of saying, which I don't want to put in your mouth, but the relationship between the stories that we read and the great story. Right. Tolkien and Lewis are approaching it different ways, but Lewis is anything but a rebel. Right. You can't tell that. You can't frame. I did it facetiously at the beginning, but you can't frame these two different approaches in terms of, well, Tolkien's the stodgy traditionalist and Lewis is the rebel. Hey, they both wore vests and smoking jackets and drank port. They both loved traditions. They both loved old things. They both wanted people to see the old things in their proper light. Right. And they were both trying to get at something bigger.
They were. And they were both part of the mid-20th century in which there was an actual overt war against the old things, which continues today. Right? But they fought in World War I. They were writing at the same time as Hemingway was writing, saying, everything's falling apart and there's nothing to believe in anymore. And then there's the guys in smoking jackets teaching medieval literature at Oxford saying, no, this is when we need the old things more than ever. That's right. This is when they have to be recovered and remembered. This is when we need to believe that there is a unifying story and that right now we're in the part in which the hero is fighting the monster. Don't give up. Something is coming. Glory is coming. It wasn't academic to them. It was historically relevant. It was necessary in kind of the crumbling of the traditional world, which we were born into. The three of us. Yeah. They were there when it was happening.
The drama was real for them.
Yes.
Yeah, the drama was real.
Before World War I, the world was populated. The Western world believed. After World War I, which they both fought in, people stopped believing. And they were saying, don't give up. Father Christmas is coming. Right? And that's, Aragorn is going to restore the land.
Reveal himself and you'll see who
they
he
were
is.
writing allegorically to say, don't forget the great story.
Beautifully said.
Amen.
Maybe the only time in modern history I can think of where essentially the grumpy old curmudgeons landed such a victory. On the one hand, the world more or less continued on the trajectory it seemed to have been put on from World War I. But on the other hand, this army of generation after generation of people who instinctively felt there's something wrong with the way things are headed were given a mythology and an imaginative perspective and a vocabulary for how they felt, and determined not to live into that. This is again, it's the only time in recent history I can think of where the grumpy old curmudgeons won. They weren't just sitting in the corner lamenting the state of things. They weren't writing grumpy movie reviews of all the things that everyone likes, saying how stupid they were. They told their own story.
For something new and fresh and positive and strong and noble and and clearly descended from the great story.
Yeah.
To go to Heidi's point.
Right. Well, and that was Lewis says in The Silver Chair. That's the whole point of The Silver Chair. It's a book about memory. And when Aslan takes Jill to the top of the mountain and tells her the signs and then says, remember, remember, remember. 3 times, Trinitarian, right? Remember, remember, remember. That was Lewis. That was Tolkien. That was the Inklings. They weren't trying to do something new. They were trying to recover something old and encouraging us to remember, remember, remember. So the academic kind of conversation of, should Father Christmas be in here or not? It's fine to take a stand and to have a friendly argument over it. But they were both doing the same thing,
Any last thoughts?
That was mine.
That was yours.
They're both masters, aren't they?
Yes.
And really, modern fantasy literature owes both of them in incomparable debt, and so does, and I think it's fabulous. You just said, Heidi, that they're trying to shore up the foundations with this in the way that they knew, Brian. Right? They didn't try and be politicians. But by golly, they were terrific writers, so they wrote great stuff. Yeah.
Well, first, one thing to take away from this as you look ahead to your own Christmas, it's bring the old things back. Remember, you can do it with such elegance and subtlety that your home is like stepping into a completely different time and place, and everyone walks out thinking that's just ridiculous. I wish everything was like that. Or you can do it in a way that's so out of place and a little bit awkward, but by golly, you're going to do it because you're going to shock people out of the Black Friday craziness and make them see something a little bit differently. Well, Merry Christmas to all of you. Go do something old, and we will talk to you in the new year.